Welcome to the Extra Space Exploration Series. Following the visit of NASA astronaut Jeff Williams to Singapore, where you get to meet him or hear him at the science centers, at the universities, and in different social settings. We are going to bring you the next 4 episodes where astronaut Jeff Williams is going to bring you on a journey of space exploration. We're going to have 4 episodes covering rockets, the International Space Station, the mission to Moon or the Artemis project, and finally, what everybody is very interested about going to Mars. Well, you can watch the videos, but we have more in store for you. You watch the videos, complete the quizzes, and you get a special recognitions, a certificate on space exploration signed by NASA astronaut Jeff Williams. This is an expired event with the partnership of Science Centre Singapore, Singapore Institute of Technology, and Neo Aeronautics. The first episode is on rockets. We are all very fascinated with rockets, with its powerful and thunderous sound that bring either a spacecraft or a satellite or a human being into space. Well, is rocket out of reach for us in Singapore, a small island? Or we can dream further. An example is Simon Gwodzd, who is my student in undergrad studies. He set up this company called Equatorial Space to build a small rockets to launch CubeSat. And he has been featured in the Straits Times, in a lot of space websites, and from a small company, he has now grown and has relocated to USA. Let's hear from our Aspire partner, NASA astronaut Jeff Williams.
Okay, well, good evening, everybody in Singapore, and good morning, very early in the morning here in the western part of the U.S. But it's great to be with you today, and I want to give a little bit of an introduction to rockets, as was mentioned, and that will lead us into next week, where we can talk a little bit about the International Space Station. But today I want to talk a little bit about basics of rockets and some of the factors that drive a rocket design. And maybe if we could go a few slides back. I think this is the last slide of my presentation, but I want to go back. Yeah, there we go. So there's obviously lots of different kinds of rockets, and this is just a spectrum example of a few. Now, all of these, except the one on the right, the space shuttle, are unmanned rockets. It's used to put up cargo or satellites into space. But rockets come in lots of different forms to serve the mission requirements of each particular rocket. The next slide shows the space shuttle, which you just saw the video of. And there we go. Space shuttle was a very unique spacecraft, obviously. It was designed originally in the 1970s and flew its first flight in 1981 and flew for about 30 years before being retired. Its primary purpose, by the way, was to put up the space station, and it accomplished that function very well. It is very unique in that it was reusable. The orbiter, the part that the crew was in and the cargo was in, was reusable. The solid rocket boosters were also reusable. They are the white, thin rockets mounted on the sides of the tank. Now let's go back to space shuttle. And then the brown tank in the middle carried the oxygen and hydrogen that were used as the propellants for the main engines of the space shuttle. The space shuttle we call a 2-stage rocket. In other words, you saw in the video, the solid rocket boosters separate about 2 minutes into launch. That was constituted the first stage, and once they separated, it went to the second stage. Incidentally, just to give you an idea of the magnitude, the size of the space shuttle, when it was sitting on the launch pad, it weighed a total of about 4 million pounds. 4 million pounds. And at this moment at liftoff, with the 3 main engines and the 2 solid rocket boosters, they in total produced a total thrust of about 7.5 million pounds of thrust. So 4 million pound rocket producing 7.5 million pounds of thrust. Obviously, thrust was greater than weight, and that resulted in the acceleration off the launch pad. The acceleration as we climbed in the ascent continued to increase because we were rapidly burning the fuel that's needed to produce the thrust. And as you burn the fuel, it gets lighter and lighter. And if you're producing the same amount of thrust, of course, the acceleration increases. And that's one of those principal. Let's go to the next slide, which is the Soyuz rocket. Now, the Soyuz is a Russian-made rocket. It's been flying since about 1967. I launched on this rocket 3 times. All flights were going to the International Space Station. It's much different than the space shuttle was. It's a standard design of a rocket. It is 3 stages to orbit. It weighs less than 1 million pounds. Actually, it weighs well less than 1 million pounds and produces about 1 million pounds of thrust. It's the same ratio. Again, most of the weight is the fuel, the kerosene, and the oxygen used to produce the thrust by the engines as we lift off. Let's go to the next slide. This next one is a very interesting picture. This picture, what you see here is you see the atmosphere of the Earth on the bottom of the picture. You can see the Earth's surface with the just below the orange stripe on the very bottom of the picture. And then you see the top of the atmosphere where the blue disappears into black. The white trail there is the contrail from a Soyuz rocket. The point of light in the upper part of the picture is the actual rocket. It's in its 3rd stage. So it's out of the atmosphere and it's flying out parallel to the Earth's surface. And we're looking at it from the International Space Station. So this was a Soyuz launched a couple of years ago, carrying a crew that would later then rendezvous to the International Space Station. Now, the plume of the rocket is not straight because of the wind currents in the different layers of the atmosphere. So what we're seeing there is the variation of wind behind the rocket that carries the plume. And what was a straight line up, it now is a little bit curved, but a very interesting, very unique picture. And you see around the point of light of where the rocket is, you also see a wide fan or circle around that point of light. That's the current plume of the rocket. Because it's up in space, the plume of the rocket expands to be very, very wide behind the rocket. Again, very interesting picture. By the way, the launch of both the space shuttle and the Soyuz rocket and ascent to space only takes less than 9 minutes, a few seconds less than 9 minutes. So in that 9 minutes, you're expending all of the fuel that you're carrying on board. You're expending about 80% of the total weight that you had at liftoff. And in that less than 9 minutes, you go from 0 sitting on the ground to 17,500 miles an hour, which is orbital velocity. And that's the phase of the overall flight that is primarily concerned with the rocket and the rocket design. The next slide, I just have a few items that I'd like to introduce you to in terms of when you rocket design and what you would consider in a rocket to meet the requirements for a given mission. The basic question is, we operationally want to fly a rocket, and we're going to take crew, and I'm going to talk specifically today about crewed rockets, rockets that will carry a crew. And we want to carry not only the crew, but we want to carry the cargo to orbit. I'm going to give you some things to think about, and specifically talk about a rocket that carries a crew and the required cargo to orbit. And I have in a slide or beyond. In the coming weeks, after next week, we'll talk about going beyond Earth orbit, using as an example, going to the moon, and then later on to Mars. You will see that it takes significantly more rocket energy to go beyond Earth orbit. When you get to Earth orbit, you're really only a little over halfway there in terms of rocket energy required to go to the moon, for example. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. But back to the crewed rocket operational factors. You want to know where you're going and how long. In other words, are you going to Earth orbit? Are you going to the International Space Station? And that's the example I'm going to use primarily today. And how long are you going to stay there? I said that the rocket is expended in less than 9 minutes, but it's carrying a spacecraft on top of it. And that spacecraft is going to stay in orbit for some period of time, depending upon the mission. For example, the space shuttle would stay on average about 2 weeks on orbit, and spend part of that time docked to the space station. The Soyuz, with the Soyuz, it serves as our lifeboat on the space station. So it stays on orbit for 6 or 7 months. And actually, the Russians recently certified the Soyuz to extend it up to 1 year. So pretty soon we'll have Soyuz spacecraft staying for 1 year on board. Also, where is your launch location? You have to consider that. If you're going to an inclination that is above at a high inclination, for example, the space station is at 51.6 degrees, which you can think in terms of latitude of the Earth, then maybe you want to have the launch location at a higher latitude. If you want to be at zero inclination, where you're flying on the equator, your launch location has to be located on the equator. So launch locations matter. Also, as I mentioned, the inclination is a factor. If we are launching a space shuttle from Florida, which is about 23 degrees latitude, as I recall, something like that, but we're going to 51 degrees, we have to be able to launch to in that case, to the northeast, and we don't want to fly over populated areas. So basically, we fly right up the east coast of the US to get to the inclination that the space station is in. With the space shuttle, we had weather constraints. We could not launch in bad weather. And not only at the launch site, but we had to consider where we could land if we had to abort the ascent and return to Earth immediately after launch. For the case of the space shuttle, for the first few minutes, we could abort and return to Florida. And that was for about the first 4 minutes or so of launch. And in the video, when you heard that, the call negative return, that meant that the space shuttle was beyond the point to have the ability to abort and return to Kennedy Space Center. At that point, our abort opportunities were across the Atlantic Ocean in either Europe or Africa, depending upon the mission. So abort opportunities, especially when you're carrying a crew, is very, very important in the design of your rocket. The final bullet, major bullet there, are the payload requirements. How much stuff do you need to take? And how much stuff do you need to take inside the pressurized cabin with the crew? And do you have outside cargo? For example, the space shuttle carried about 40,000 pounds of cargo outside in the payload bay. And then it carried maybe a couple thousand pounds of cargo inside. The Soyuz carries a crew of 3 and just a few hundred pounds of cargo. So completely different mission requirements and completely different designs of the rocket to carry the spacecraft and the crew. The next slide just lists a couple of the major factors in rocket design. For example, the propulsion system. And when you talk about rockets, the primary system, of course, is propulsion. You can look up on the internet lots of great websites that give a discussion on the so-called rocket equation. And the rocket equation is very simple in essence, but it's very complicated in implementing it. It basically says that your rocket performance is a function of how much of the percentage of the weight, the total weight or mass at liftoff, is propellant, and the velocity that you're putting the exhaust out through the nozzle. The higher the velocity, the exhaust, the more thrust you get, the better the rocket is going to work. The more of the weight, the percentage of the weight, that is the propellant, that is the fuel and the oxidizer, the more efficient your rocket will be. That's why the space shuttle, for example, carried what I said was about 40,000 pounds of cargo and 7 crew members. I didn't say this, but when it landed, it weighed about 205,000 pounds. So a little over 200,000 pounds. You'll recall that I said that the liftoff weight was about 4.5 million pounds. Much of that weight was the propellant that I talked about. Much of that weight was the hardware of the rocket itself, the solid rocket booster casings, the external tank, the engines themselves, all of the plumbing. So you're carrying extra weight, but you want to have the propellant mass ratio as high as possible. If you did the math, you would find that a rocket mass ratio is about 85% fuel and oxidizer. So 85% of the liftoff weight is the propellant that it takes just to get to orbit in that first 9 minutes. I talked about the space shuttle having 2 stages, the Soyuz having 3 stages. And that we get into stages of rockets, and that's driven by the physics, by that rocket equation, because when you stage a rocket, first stage, you jettison it, you jettison away weight, so that then you improve your mass fraction at that point in the ascent to be able to improve the efficiency of the rocket. Some rockets are reusable. SpaceX, for example, has pioneered the ability to refly the first stage booster back to the launch site and land it so it can be reused with the intent to save cost for ongoing sequence of rocket uses. The fuel type matters. The space shuttle burned liquid hydrogen, which is very efficient. The Soyuz burns essentially kerosene or standard rocket fuel. So, and there's costs and complexity and efficiency trade-offs that go into the fuel that you decide to use. So the propulsion system obviously is the main factor in a rocket design. Guidance, navigation, and control is also very important to your rocket. You can burn all the fuel and oxidizer that you have, but if you don't go to the right place, it doesn't do you any good. So you need to get to a target orbit. And using the space station as an example, it is 51.6 degrees inclination. So you have to launch into that inclination. And the launch site, which for the shuttle was, of course, Kennedy Space Center, passed under the orbital plane of the space station once a day. So at that particular moment of the day, that is when you had to launch. If you were targeting a specific day to launch, you had to figure out when that launch site, when the Kennedy Space Center passed, as the Earth rotated, passed under the inertial plane of the space station orbit and launch at that specific moment. And then you had to guide yourself up first to get out of the atmosphere, and then basically turn to parallel the Earth's surface so that you can accelerate to that orbital velocity. In the meantime, as I mentioned before, you had to consider what abort capability you had. And I talked about the first 4 minutes having the ability to abort and return to Kennedy Space Center, and later to, if you had to abort, go into to Europe or to Africa. After that first less than 9 minutes, a little less than 9 minutes, and the rocket was done, of course, you ended up in an orbit, and you needed to be in an orbit that had not only the required velocity to stay in orbit, but a certain height and a parabolic height. So it wasn't a true circle, it was more of a parabolic orbit so that you could phase your approach to the space station. I'll talk a little bit more about that next week. But that's was very important as well, because you needed to rendezvous to the space station and then dock with it. And of course that led it up to the docking requirements and the final docking to the space station. So just a few factors to think about: guidance, navigation, and control. Control, by the way, during the ascent is primarily done by the thrust vectoring. You could take the nozzles and move them to be able to control your pitch and your yaw and your roll as you went up. And the computer system, the navigation software, navigated it and sent signals to the control system to do that thrust vectoring. And guidance is a function of guiding you to that destination that you wanted to go, in this case to an orbit that later would allow you to rendezvous to the space station. And then the final major bullet on this slide, of course, is life support systems. You're leaving the Earth's atmosphere. You're taking a crew. We need oxygen to continue to breathe. We need to remove the carbon dioxide that we're exhaling. We need to remove the humidity. We need to maintain a comfortable temperature. We need to keep the contaminants out of the air. And we need to also take all of the stuff that we need to just maintain life for the space flight leading up to docking, and then of course later to the return to Earth. So just a few examples of things that you have to consider in your rocket design. Let's see. The next slide is just an old photograph. And it's my final slide. It's just a little bit of history. If you want to study a topic that's very interesting, study the development of the history of the development of rocketry. And this is a picture from way back in early or mid 20th century. A lot of what we know in the rocket industry came out of some early research in the early 20th century. In the 1930s and 40s, it was really developed extensively in the 40s with World War II, and then the aftermath of World War II, primarily for military applications, but then later, of course, we know the history of the space race and the history since this. But it's a very interesting history. There were parallel developments going on in Russia, in Germany, and other places in Europe and the United States. A very interesting history that I encourage you to read up on.
Now you're ready to do the quiz to participate in space exploration. Sign up to the link below.